You're listening to Theatrum Mundi Live. I'm Andrea Cetrulo, program curator at Theatrum Mundi, and I welcome you to the first episode of Incantations. What are the different meanings of magic? How can imagination empower us? Does solidarity require an identity, a social or political affiliation? This is part one of a conversation with guests Federico Campagna and Chiara Ambrosio. Here we discuss Federico's book, Magic and Technic, The Reconstruction of Reality, published by Bloomsbury in 2018, and Chiara Ambrosio's film, La Frequenza Fantasma, or The Phantom Frequency. Both authors posit magic as a frame of reality for understanding and experiencing the world. Federico Campagna is a philosopher and writer based in London. His research combines metaphysics, theology, and cultural studies with the aim of exploring fundamental strategies for emancipation in the 21st century. Chiara Ambrosio is a filmmaker and visual artist working with animation, documentary, sound, and the printed matter. Welcome, Chiara and Federico. It is a true pleasure to have you both join me today for the inaugurational podcast of the Incantations series. Although you weren't familiar with each other's work beforehand, there are so many parallelisms in your approach to the subject of magic and its potential to challenge established notions or conventions of what reality means. That I guess it only makes sense for us or you to be having this conversation today. So tell us a little bit about yourself, what your work is based around, and how you approach the notion of magic. Maybe Chiara can start.
Sure. So I'm a filmmaker and visual artist, and my work so far with the moving image specifically, but also more recently with sound and radio broadcast, and specifically with relationship to the city and my project Raft within the City of London, is very much a way to explore engagement with place. Not just as a constructed space, but as a space of possibility and very much as a work in progress. My work is very much centered around process, and it always culminates in something, a film, a publication, a radio broadcast. But the main part of the research is done through the process of encountering a space, a person in space, a particular narrative within a space, and how these narratives and the space itself interact and transform through this encounter. I should say that I am Southern Italian, and I've lived in London for 21 years. It's the first time that I've been working in London. Specifically with my most recent project, Raft. My previous films were, my first feature film was shot in a semi-abandoned village in Calabria, where I come from. And that explored notions of seeing things into existence, which is something that I am very interested in. I have a background in stop motion animation and photography, and I'm very interested in how the lens and the act of framing can literally conjure things into existence simply through shining a light on things that are often too small, too slow, too fleeting to be seen in normal life, but that with the aid of a lens and of time and attention can actually become not just visible, but also take center stage and offer an alternative narrative, which is often very important in order to understand the wide sort of prismatic world that we inhabit. My approach to this idea in London has been slightly different, because my relationship with the city is very much anchored around relationships with people. And so I'm trying to adopt a similar approach by trying to shine a light on conversations and bodies and in ways of embodying that are often um, difficult to notice and that slip, especially in a city like London where everything slips so fast and there's very few points of uh, um, interruption. It's London is more and more a city that invites speed and invites kind of an ephemeral way of relating to surfaces, to history, to place. And I am trying to subvert that relationship with place by having very long, often tangential, convoluted um, conversations and walks with people within the city to see what can be revealed of the city through this encounter and conversation. In itself, it's a ritual, and it relies very much on a belief that what we are traversing, the spaces that we are traversing, are more than what we can see, and that our physical presence there can subvert what they mean. And so I'd say, to summarize what I do, I'm very interested in this. I'm very interested in seeing through a camera with a body, seeing things into existence that aren't often dominant or visible in our existence.
Yes, that definitely connects to Federico's work. I was just going through my notes, and there's a line. I think it's in your it's a Magic and Technic, Federico. What else is technic as the essence of technology, but the spirit of absolute instrumentality, according to which everything is merely a means to an end, where the only ultimate end is the limitless expansion of the accumulated productive ability. So that connects somehow, I believe, to what Chiara was just speaking about this ephemerality and transparency somehow of our late capitalist societies.
Yes, I completely agree with Chiara that there is something unique about the act of putting a frame around things. A frame is, as Chiara says, that thing which makes something emerge. It's strange if we think about it, but we already live with the frame within our mind. In the act of making a film, you make explicit that there is a particular frame, which is sometimes a frame of the screen, or maybe a frame inside the screen, or a particular way of shooting. But already when we walk around on the street or when we look around in a room, we have already a frame inside our mind. It's the way in which we perceive things. For example, the frame that we have in our mind makes us perceive things in space and time. Space and time are not features of reality in itself. This is something that we have discovered many times. Often humans rediscover the same things multiple times and always forget. We discovered it through philosophy, through religion, and then recently through science. And so space and time, for example, are frames as such. And through these frames, we can perceive the world. Unfortunately, we cannot get rid of all the frames and perceive the world as it is, purely outside of any frame, absolute freedom, the thing in itself. We don't seem to be able to do that. We seem to be able to see only in a specific way, according, let's say, to the technology that is inscribed within us. The same happens also at the level of collectives, not only at the level of individuals. Also, as a society, we tend to create certain structures, certain frames of sense. A frame of sense is not just a metaphor. Sense, the way in which things make sense, is the frame, so the space, the way in which we may allow objects to take part to our world, the way in which we allow experiences to come to us as real. We take them seriously because they make sense. And we take them seriously and they make sense because they appear to us inside a certain frame. In part, this is the frame, the human frame of the individual. In part, is the social frame. The experience of living in London makes you realize how strong sometimes certain social frames are and the way in which they create not just particular experiences of life, but also particular worlds emerge.
It would be interesting to kind of expand a little bit, probably on that notion that you distinguish, Federico, as North and South, and the divide between what you call technic, and that you see as emerging in Northern Europe, and magic that emerges in the Mediterranean region, or your own kind of conception of the Mediterranean region. So a question to both would be: would you argue that non-Western cultures have acquired a thinner skin, kind of, that allows them to be more in touch with that magic? I'm thinking about, spiritist practices from around the world that are still alive, as shown in Chiara's film, The Ghost Frequency, and how this translates into our ways of experiencing the places we inhabit, even in cities.
If you don't mind, Chiara, I would like to start responding to this. Is that okay? Both Chiara and I have the similar experience of being migrants. And when we are a migrant, we realize that places don't quite exist in the way in which sedentary people believe they exist. If you spend your entire life in one place, you think that places exist like rock solid objects. They don't. Places are, first of all, imaginations. They are imaginal. They are a bit like the mythological cities described in The 1001 Night. They exist in that way, places. Okay, so this is the first disclaimer. Why is this an important disclaimer when we talk about Western and non-Western world? Because the West and the non-West are exactly the same thing. So we have to be careful when we think about Western and non-Western culture. What are we exactly talking about? Western culture, what exactly is it? For example, as a Southern Italian, am I a Western subject? To what extent? Personally, I come from a mix of Arabic, Albanian, Spanish, and Greek blood. So I am Western, maybe not even geographically. The notion of the West was invented in the 19th century, not before that time. And it was invented by President Monroe in the US, not in Europe. And it was invented to define the difference between America and the old world. There was Europe and there was the West. The West being all the American states free from the shackles of the old colonial powers. So when we say Western, what exactly do we mean? This is important to clarify. When we mean non-Western also, what exactly do we mean? The difference that there is between China in any moment in its development and Europe in many parts of its development is much less than there is between China and the forest regions of Indonesia or the desertic steppes that there are to its west. The non-West is not an enormous kind of like pot where everything is blended together in a soup. There's very many different things. I would be very wary of fetishizing the non-West and also very wary of believing in the existence of the West. My attempt is always to clarify that the West in itself doesn't exist, or it exists only as an imagination. And if we then have to pick an imagination, the imagination of the West is definitely not one that I like or that I want to be part of. That particular flavor of the idea of belonging to the West adds very little to my way of thinking. It owes almost everything to that particular American form of culture that derived from, the experience mainly of the late 19th, 20th century, and then the brief period of glory of the US and the sudden decline. It's not something that interests me. I would suggest rather to invent different places. That's why I often talk about the Mediterranean, for example.
Can I add just one thing? That another interesting thing that strikes me as Federico was talking is, considering that we both come from the south of Italy, for example, Italy as a place, growing up in Italy, you're very, very attuned to the idea that a place, a country is very much a construction, so an imagined space as much as anything else. Italy is the north of Italy and the south of Italy are two completely different identities with different histories, different genealogies, different biographies, etc. And Naples is a really interesting city to me because as one place, it exists on so many different physical levels. It has a level above ground. It has a level below ground. It's two two cities and several cities at once. And if you talk to different people within the same city, there are so many different imagined spaces that coexist within the same geographical space, and not just the two cities itself, but for example the reality of the geological city. So the city as a mass of land that does not even fit the parameters of either the city above or the city below, but is something else completely. And I think it's really interesting to think about this in relationship to what I was saying earlier about, you know, when you were talking about framing and seeing things into existence. I think a lot of what I'm talking about is to do with the fact that a same space is bound to be more things that you can ever mention, and so it is a very useful exercise to always shy away from categorizations, but actually like look at the very small framework within which you're operating and thinking about what it is and how do you inhabit it and how do you embody it, and as such, what are you exposing about it.
To pick up a little bit on what you were saying about magic, because I imagine that you wanted to go in that direction. In both questions, you were inserting that element. Also, magic, I think, has to be investigated a little bit before we can assign it to any particular part of the world or any particular practice. There's many meanings that are assigned to a word, and of course, it's always possible to invent also new meanings. But for the sake of communication, sometimes it's easy to kind of try to define things a little bit. Etymology is usually a good way to define things and to try to find a little bit, at least the bedrock of a term. So magic is a Greek word in itself, comes from Magic and Technic, which means the art of the Magi. Who are these Magi? Who have this art, the art of magic? The Magi were the priests of Zoroastrian Persia. So we're talking about Iran, basically. In terms of territory, much bigger than contemporary Iran at the time. The priests of Zoroastrian Persia were called the Magi, and they were the depositaries of a number of traditions and wisdom and particular rituals. The important thing to keep in mind is that when the Greeks talk about the art of the Magi, they're not talking about the art of some strange people from a faraway land. They're talking about the typical trait, the most essential identitarian trait of their arch enemy. Okay, to the Greeks, the Persians are the enemy. The Greeks are credited with inventing the word barbarian, but they didn't care about the barbarians. They particularly cared about the Persians, because the Persians attacked them twice, and then the Greeks finally conquered them with Alexander the Great. So what is the art of the Magi? Is the art of the other, literally the other. The Greeks were democratic, the Persians had a monarchy. The Greeks were very few, the Persians were very many, and so on and so forth. The Greeks had philosophy, the art, and the Persians had magic. So when we talk about magic here, we are always talking about something that belongs to either somebody else or to some other world. And I think in the terms of trying to see in certain practices an opening onto another world, okay, here I think is the very useful aspect of magic and the one that interests me the most.
Yeah, that is something you mentioned, I believe, in one of your talks that I watched. That is more, and also you get, I believe you mentioned that when you spoke with Garrett Evans about your film, The Ghost Frequency, that it's more about creating a space, a sort of atmosphere or lens through which we see the world and understand it. Probably a better way of explaining what magic is, as a kind of filter and atmosphere, a way of deconstructing or not resisting actively, but kind of being immersed or open to the emergence of alternative narratives of reality that escape the hegemonic or accepted in terms of technical language, as Federico puts it.
But also in terms of your own notions of what reality is, which is a little bit what you talk about, Federico, in in your book, from what I gather from the conference you gave, when I was talking about the ghost frequency, it was very interesting for me to consider the fact that I was going back to a place that I thought I knew, a region where I was born, where I spent, well, I wasn't born there, but I spent a lot of my childhood there. A town that I had visited, but that actually revealed itself as something completely other than what I thought I could ever know about it. And the only way in which I could find a language in which to speak about this place was to physically walk through it, and in fact walk through a similar route. I kept going back. I went back for 7 years. It took me 7 years to make the film and to actually find this language through which to converse with the place. And the way I started seeing it was that I was walking in a circular route, but this route, rather than a circle, ended up being more like a spiral. So at every revolution, something transformed, both in my perception of the place and in the way in which the place was opening up to me. And in that sense, speaking about the practice of opening another way of looking into reality, that's something that I'm interested in. How can you create practices, processes that can place you in an unexpected relationship with your spaces and the language that usually binds you to a space and a place.
I would like to also, from what Chiara is noticing, so maybe also try to draw some philosophical conclusions in part, or suggestions. So it is true that every time you return to a place, that place has changed in a strange way, even though nothing has really changed. Then this kind of like leads us to ask if that place exists by itself at all. And of course, the answer is yes and no. A place exists by itself even when nobody's there, even outside of your dreams or outside of your experience, to a certain extent. But it doesn't exist as a place. It exists just as a thing devoid of particular attributes. It exists as pure existence, basically. The moment it becomes something for somebody. It doesn't become something in itself. To say it better, objects exist, but they become those particular objects: a pen, a memory, a home, or an enemy, or a friend, and so on and so forth, only when they enter in a relationship with somebody. It is somebody that makes something appears. When there is no relationship, that something doesn't become a void. It remains pure existence, devoid of attributes. This, I think, encourages us to understand that the world in itself, every single place and every single object in the world, is a similar type of item. On the one hand, it is exactly what we make of it. So this empowers us with the ability to reinvent literally everything from scratch, not just social conventions, but literally what objects are, what populates our world. And on the other hand, it kind of gives us the reassurance that when we stop this process of continuous reinvention, we don't destroy the universe. Simply we let it linger in the state of pure existence, which is the bedrock of things. In the way in which I, for example, understand when I talk about magic in a recent book that I wrote, when I understand the system of reality, the way in which we make world, which I call magic, because it is very different from the one that we experience today, which I call technique. The central point is precisely this: recognizing in every single object, in every single thing, that there is a kernel, a heart of that thing, of that object, that is beyond and outside and free from any modification of anything, not because it is stable and fixed in one particular identity, but because it is stable and fixed in its not having any identity, any particular form, in its being pure existence. So it is a combination of freedom and reassurance. This is interesting, I think, especially in the 21st century, because in the 20th and the 19th century, we often found ourselves deciding whether we wanted reassurance or freedom. And the two things went in disastrous directions both ways. Finding a balance between the two is one of the important challenges of philosophy today, I think.
Yes, I think that's quite interesting, because both your works also, as you're speaking, Federico, I'm thinking of, the subject of ontology and subjectivity, and both your works reminded me somehow, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with them, Carlo Ginzburg and the Italian historicist, which point towards imagination, and I guess in a way art or poetry or different configurations, or alternative, subaltern versions of reality. So again, I think this is the case in the ghost frequency, which is set in a rural setting. But would you say this could be extrapolated as well to your current efforts of maintaining the subaltern cultural legacies in cities, such as the Horse Hospital, this amazing venue in London?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to connect what you just said to what Federico was saying about reassurance and freedom and the struggle between the two, one thing that kickstarted my project actually was, I worked for a long time in a very small independent artist bookshop. It's a harbor. It's a place of shelter for, in many ways, it's outside of a mainstream form of exchange. It doesn't really operate in the way many other shops operate. And what it does is that it offers a space for very small books to find a space, often handmade, and often, in fact, akin to what your theme is, incantation, in the sense of like repeating something, repeating a formula, repeating something until it itself exists and comes into existence. And I'm interested in the practice of making as part of that, and the bookshop itself made me think of this place that I encountered when I was in New York. New York is another city that I spent a lot of time in, and there was a botanica. Are you familiar with botanicas in East Harlem? The botanicas were shops that were built by the mainly Puerto Rican diaspora in New York, and they were initially there to supply what was needed by the syncretic religions to function. So they sold objects, they sold potions, they sold herramienta, the things that were necessary for the cults that came with people into New York. But later on, they took on a really interesting, a far more interesting form of syncretic role. And what one guy told me that I became friends with, he was called Jorge, and he ran the oldest botanica in East Harlem, was that as the neighborhood changed, what the botanica had become was a place in which people from all faiths, all backgrounds, atheists, Catholics, all kinds of people went to try and find a balance again between this. They were struggling with a desire for freedom as citizens of as migrants in a place that didn't recognize them fully, and also as citizens of a place that wasn't able to give them the sustenance that they needed in order to exist fully and properly. And he told me that his role had changed significantly from that of being like, a signifier of a particular religion, to becoming a place in which this struggle between reassurance and freedom actually was taking place. And so I really think that cities, in a way, in a city like London, like same as New York, when you are writing a narrative on any level, when you are making a film, when you are talking to edit something that will be broadcast on the air and that will occupy the space of the airwaves, whether you are a weaver, whether you are anyone who is somehow forming a narrative, you are always encountering this the same questions that I was encountering with the Frequenza Fantasma. So the space is radically different, not because it's a different, as Federico said, not because it's either east or west, but because the different cities, the different spaces operate in very different ways. But our movement within them requires a similar set of anchor points in order for us to be able to unravel a narrative within them.
One thing that Chiara mentioned is very, very dear to me as well, and very close to my own heart, and it's the notion of syncretism. Syncretism is usually the most forgotten of all possible ways of living together. Usually, when we think about migration, we tend to think about integration or ghettos, or exclusion. Okay, this exclusion, integration, ghetto. These are the various ways. Syncretism is usually forgotten. The reason why I often mention the Mediterranean as an imaginal but also historical region is because in that particular region, syncretism has been the main dish since, I don't even know where to begin, since at least the time of the Mycenaeans, okay, since a couple of thousand years before Christ. Syncretism allows you to combine all the different elements that culture has to provide with the attitude of somebody who is not paying slavish worship to the social idols, but somebody who is ransacking an armory or a workshop, acquiring all the tools that they need to live. Now, in order to get to the point of syncretism, though, it is necessary first to be able to free oneself or distance oneself, at least to a certain extent, from their own particular identitarian forms. So it is important to forget, at least a little bit, what other people tell you that you are. In order to be able to forget, these places that Chiara and you also were mentioning are very important. I think, for example, about the experience of mystics in the Mediterranean region and beyond. The Mediterranean region is very wide. We could make it start in India, to be honest, and stretch it all the way to Ireland, probably. But in that particular region, the forms of mysticism always invite the mystic to begin their work with practices of desocialization. So ways of stepping outside of one's particular social roles and social positions. You find it also in the gospel, when Jesus Christ says that in order to follow him, you have to renounce your mother and father, your children, and so on and so forth. It doesn't mean that you have to renounce these people. It means that you have to renounce your own condition of being a son or a daughter, to being a father or a mother, to be a husband. It is to that you have to renounce, to step outside of your social identification.
In these times that we're living as we speak, people have been forced to kind of spend more time with themselves, probably inside their homes, with their thoughts on their own. So do you think that turning, that this could be an opportunity in a sense to kind of rethink what solitude means and the potential benefits of getting to know one's own mental workings?
These practices of desocialization are difficult, but also they require some space and time, some places where they can take place. In the contemporary city, they become in part complicated because most of our life is spent at work, but they still remain important. Now, we could do this collectively, and so locations like the bookshop that you were mentioning, Chiara, or that particular shop in Harlem you were mentioning serve this function. But sometimes also it is dangerous to create them collectively, because then you start to create a further identity on top, which is the identity of those who don't have an identity, and so on and so forth. It's the endless spiral. This is often the problem that is encountered in monastic communities. At the beginning, monastic communities were not communities. The monk is a monos, so one that is alone. So the point of the monks is to not be bothered by other monks. And often the hermit steps outside of the monastic community to be entirely on their own. In this also is possible, I think, to find a redeeming value in the notion of loneliness or solitude or isolation, which is one of the great plagues of our century, in part because it is difficult, in part because it is enforced, which is always a bad thing. Whatever is enforced, including happiness, it always has an element of poison to it. But in part also because we don't have an imagination that allows us to redeem the position of being alone, isolated, and separated. the experiences, for example, of mysticism, apart from the incredible wealth of philosophical, theological, existential things that disclose to us, also allow us to find this redeeming factor in the desocializing and thus beneficent element that there is also in loneliness.
Can I just say one thing, going back to what you were saying about the loneliness and alone? It made me think very much. I was editing just before we met, and I've been editing a conversation for my film that I had with this wonderful British writer and professor called Sukhdev Sandhu. I don't know if you know him, but he's based in America now, and he wrote a book called Night Haunts about London, but seen from at night, from people who work at night. And it's a really beautiful book. And he's a real wordsmith. He's a master of like riffing. He's like a musician of, he speaks like he makes music. And we were talking about the notion of the eccentric, so the person that steps out of the center, right? So in a way, trying to achieve this place of like not isolation, but actually being with yourself, being one, monos, right? And he was saying he's always been attracted by the eccentric, that the thing that is away from the center, but that lately, as he aged, he's become a lot more interested in the middle as a space for potential. So in a city like London, the center of London, we met in the middle of Trafalgar Square, which would be a place that any of us would try and steer right clear of most times. But he was arguing that now the center is quite an interesting space to be, because far from being a place of like distraction and confusion, it's the new place where you can be really alone with your thoughts. It's a place where you're not checking your phone every 3 seconds. It's a place where you're just trying to navigate yourself as a body in space. It's a place where you are made aware of the institutions that control you, contain you, define you, and that often continue to do so even when you think you are in isolation. So the question of like what an institution is and how that defines who you are even when you are alone is something that I'm really interested in how you can sort of restructure your looking and your listening and your attention towards a way of engaging that is more aware and attuned to the things that limit you and define you, and then from there finding ways in which you can be, willfully be eccentric, move away from those institutions and cultivate, well, I keep going back to language, but cultivate a language through which to place yourself as other to these institutions. And I'm not talking just about the institution as a gallery or a university or a family, but a much more subtle way of, even the city, the architecture of a city, the rhythms, the sounds of a city, the way in which the sounds of a city determine the number of footsteps you take every day, those kinds of institutions that affect you in such subtle levels. Often when I place my camera, this is something that I found very interesting when shooting the ghost frequency, and just waiting, I just put my camera down and looked through the viewfinder and just waited and waited and waited, and I could feel things shedding from me, literally. I mean, to the point of it becoming akin to torture somehow. But it's a little bit like what happens to me when I sit in front of a Tarkovsky film. The first 7 minutes, I feel like I'm walking through some kind of membrane, and some people might call it fall asleep, but I have this moment of like nodding into a new way of looking. And I am interested to see what happens when you include that in the process of making work and of looking, not just making films, but also just looking at the city. Like what happens if you allow yourself, to go back to what Federico, you were saying about the parameters of space and time as a frame. How can you disintegrate or dissolve this space and time through yielding it rather than resisting it, through really entering it.
Yeah, sorry. If you don't mind, Chiara, I would like to respond because there's a couple of things that caught my mind. One is that we are isolated, but we are not alone, which is one of the worst conditions. I mean, I wake up, I check my phone, and I find messages, and I check my work email, which is stupidly I put on my phone, and so on and so forth. I'm bombarded. I feel harassed constantly, as if I had a multitude of people in the house that I never invited. So, I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure that we are that alone. We are isolated, which is another problem. We are connected but isolated and crowded. The other thing that kind of like made me think is when you was talking about the editors about giving something back, and this is also something that it's a slip of the tongue. We often say this, especially in Britain. There is this big thing of giving back and so on and so forth. But giving back to whom or to what exactly? So I would like to be philosophically specific about that. So we need to specify. Otherwise, we're not giving back. We're just spreading, pissing in the wind. So to whom exactly we're giving back? And we're giving back something that was given to us, which is exactly what? At the moment, we're talking also about loneliness and solitude quite a bit, not just in itself, but as a necessary precondition to enact a magical work on reality and so on and so forth. One of the things that came to mind is that the experience of isolation is transversal to all classes to a certain extent. The benefit and the possibility of solitude, however, seems to be a privilege of the rich. The poor, on the other hand, I don't come from a rich background. I live in one of the poorest areas in London, and because of limited access to money, I don't have the privilege of being disconnected from my phone or anything like that. I need to be connected to my phone. I need to be connected to my email because I need to work, and I need to work every day. Otherwise, bills are unpaid and so on and so forth. The rich, on the other hand, have the possibility of having a real privacy, as in an area that is private to them, elements of their life when they can become disconnected. Now, what is fantastic is that there is a particular rhetoric that is being built to justify the shitty experience of the poor, where they are constantly overcrowded, which is this focus on community, which I find very poisonous. Community is a typical way of selling some shit goods by repackaging them in some fancy packaging. Community should be an option. What Max Stirner used to call the union of egoists, which is, to be honest, any healthy relationship. My partner and I are together because we want to. If we stop wanting it, we are no longer together. Fine, you know. A community is not something like that. A community you are caged within. And at the same time, in a community, the point is that you are rooted in the territory where you are, rooted like a carrot, rooted like a weed. Now, this focus on becoming local, becoming part of the community, is just a way to covering the fact that you don't have an option. You are, if you're poor, you don't have any privacy. If you're poor, you don't have any time. If you're poor, you cannot afford to be foreign. If you're rich, you can afford to be foreign. If you're poor, you have to become local, otherwise you're cast out and so on and so forth. Now, the problem is that sometimes the poorest rate in society have a tendency to take pride in their own chains. This is an old mistake that we always make. On the other hand, so there is a lot of rhetoric also coming from popular classes talking about how we should be proud of our community and so on and so forth. On the other hand, I myself, as an anarchist, I've always believed that, for example, anarchy is not what is usually described, but anarchy is best described as aristocracy for all. So not like the bread and roses, as they say, and reclaiming for ourselves the possibility of having privacy, the possibility of being foreign, the possibility of not being part of a community for ourselves who are not rich. And so this foreignness is what allows you to be foreign, Chiara was saying, not just from institutions, but also from the city. And I would also radicalize it to say that you can also be foreign from your gender. You can be foreign from the fact of being human. You can be foreign from the fact from your age and so on and so forth. This doesn't have to be declinated once again in terms of a community. So you become part of the queer community or the trans community or whatever else community. It can also become, as the rich afford themselves to do, to become a very proud individual foreignness.
You know, it made me think of, I don't know if you're familiar with the cult of the Capuzzelle, le anime del purgatorio in Naples.
Listen to the next episode of Incantations if you'd like to hear more about the Neapolitan cult of Santa Maria dell'Anima del Purgatorio, and what our guests have to say about the recent resurgence in the interest in magical practices and witchcraft in cities.